It is my pleasure to welcome David Murrin to Decouple China Radio. David is an eminent scholar, prolific author of numerous books, articles, and journals. David is an international thought leader and speaker. He serves as a geopolitical forecaster to financial markets and governments. He is called upon as a strategic advisor. His latest book, Red Lightening, How the West Lost World War III to China in 2025, is available at Amazon, and his website, davidmurrin, murrin.co.uk/book/red-lightning. Welcome, David.
It's really a privilege to be here, Paul, and thank you for asking me. It's a message that I think is really important that the population of America hears, because America is the only thing standing in the way of Chinese ambitions at the moment.
You have put together a combination of different capabilities and methodologies to understand the parallels between past conflicts and wars and what you see on the horizon today with China and the threat.
I have, and I think, funny enough, from a child, I was fascinated by war. I think my mother was really alarmed when she said, "What would you like me to read to you?" And I pulled out this book about Russian tanks. So it started very early on. I think we all have a question as to how and why wars start, because if we haven't, we're really being deluded. If you look at the history of mankind, how often they've been fought. And through an interesting path, which we can read about, I've ended up in a position of thinking or being able to communicate just how human systems really operate. And I think to give the context of this, there is such a thing as an empire, and there is such a thing as an empire cycle, which I believe I've proven, and it has 5 stages. Expansive stages are driven by demographics, and the contractive stages by the converse, actually a shrinking population with an influx often of different kind of immigrants with different values, which comes at the end. And what's fascinating is that every empire for 2,500 years does exactly the same thing at the time in the cycle. And when I did my research, I looked at every empire, and the research was triggered after 9/11. But where we are right now is really the point, and that is that we in the West are part of what I call the super Western Christian Empire. It started back with the Portuguese, it rolled into the Spanish, then the Dutch were next, then the French, then Britain became the biggest of empires in terms of its first global maritime hegemon. And then the Germans challenged twice. First of all, they challenged as a Christian system, and subsequently in World War II, they challenged as an atheist system. And at the same time, America grew up simultaneously. And I would always actually maintain that if it hadn't been Germany, it would have been America that challenged directly for power, because America by the 1940s was the most powerful economy in the world. So it was inevitable. What happened is that we ended up in a Cold War paradigm with, the Western world led by America, the atheist world, which split from Christianity to be atheist to define the difference. And then essentially the Cold War was won by the West and America, with this construct that we thought democracy would last forever. But in fact, the reality was, just like Rome split into East and West, that wasn't a positive dynamic, that was a negative process. And the Cold War represented a similar split of a similar magnitude. And so in short, America is the last of the Western Christian empires, and it went into the 5th stage of decline at 9/11. So America has been in the terminal phase of decline for the past 20 years. And every hallmark from the time I created this algorithm in about 2002, 2003 has been predictable, from the behavior of presidents to the use of debt to the spurious wars which distracted from the main threat. And that main threat came from the Super Asian Empire. And it may surprise people to realize that these two systems have been clashing for 100 years. First, because Japan was the first empire of the Asian super empire. And obviously we know what happened there, from the Russians who suffered defeat to the Japanese defeat by America in World War II. But there was a second system. Just as the Christian system had multiple national empires, the second system of China started its ascendancy as far back as 1902 in the Boxer Revolution. It spent the next 50 years reforming itself into a civil war, which ended the first stage, regionalization. And it has been in an expansive stage since the end of its civil war, almost 70 years. And it started its second stage back then. And to anyone that says it's a peaceful nation, you just have to look at its history. It went to war with everyone it could, every neighbor, whenever it could. And the only problem it then faced was it couldn't go any further and was blocked by America, and clearly blocked by the strength of carriers in the third Taiwan Straits crisis in 1996. And that was when they activated a strategy. And that strategy was how to covertly expand their influence under the umbrella of American superpower, which at the time looked like it would last for 50 years. And they created a plan to basically dupe the West, to encourage America that fundamentally wanted, like all humans, we all want to think other people would like to be like us, to dupe the West into investing, and especially America, investing in them, believing that money inflows would create capitalist outputs, would create democratic outputs. But we were completely duped because they had no intention of doing it. This was a clear strategy of drawing us in whilst extracting our IP. Basically, we paid for the industrial power base that we now face in China because of our own greed and our blindness. And then as that process accelerated, we saw, the Iraq bogged down, the Afghan bogged down failures in Ukraine, a sequence of what I call pilot wars. And at a stage of hegemonic challenge, the challenging hegemon tries to build up a comparable force. But what it looks for is a failure of national intent and capability. For Britain, the Boer War was the thing that triggered the Kaiser's challenge and the arms race from 1906 onwards. And he had an opportunity when the Dreadnought class of warships were launched, which invalidated 50 years of naval investment by the British Empire, and they had to start all over again, building a new class of warship. And this arms race erupted as the energy of the challenger took advantage of that moment. And China has been doing that. It's been building its economy, extracting IP, seeking advantage initially asymmetrically and covertly, undermining our Western institutions, whether it's the World Health Organization, whether it's leaders like Biden or Boris, where they target their families to essentially make sure they have Chinese business links, which neuters them or makes them semi-pro-Chinese because they've got family members who have business links. We're being assaulted from every direction. In the meantime, as we look at that undermining process, which effectively has clipped our warning bell, we have seen China accelerate its capability to build weapons of comparable capability to the West, recognizing it has the greatest manufacturing base the world's ever seen since America entered the war and turned on its manufacturing base, which won World War II. That's what we face. We face what America did to the rest of the world in World War II. When they have a warship they like, they'll build hundreds of them faster than we can dream of them. And there's another mechanism that's really key here. They've not just focused on things which are comparable. Just like any challenging hegemon, they've sought asymmetric advantage with weapon systems that the hegemon didn't really think were valid. So, for example, if you look at the use of the U-boat in World War I, the Germans had failed to match dreadnought for dreadnought. They didn't have enough warships to win the Battle of Jutland. They were outfought, and that was really when they put the squeeze on using U-boats for the first time and almost starved Britain and closed the Atlantic off if we hadn't to put convoys into action. They did exactly the same in the Second World War, this asymmetric force structure, because we still really hadn't learned our lesson of our vulnerability or refused to see it. And in that regard, Red Lightning is essentially the story of how that asymmetry comes to fruition. It essentially outlines that we've been on a road to war, and I call it a road to war because every industrial expanding nation, from Japan to two Germanys, and now China, follow this 11-stage sequence of expansion and evolution of their internal mechanisms, their economy, the way they enter into an arms race, their strategic advancement, for example, into the first island chain. All of those things are a road to war that has been trodden clearly before. There is no doubt. And if we wish to really ask the question, is there doubt? And some of your listeners will. I have a way of classifying cycles of empires, and they're either contracting or they're expanding. For 120 years, every expanding nation went to war, and that includes America in the Spanish-American War of 1898, because America essentially needed the island hopping ability and the assets of Spain to build a Pacific and Caribbean empire. So even America has followed this course. And so this shouldn't be a surprise. It would be an exception if China didn't do this. With all the signals that have been coming across from Beijing, it's very difficult to even think they will be an exception. In fact, their exceptionality may come in the level of aggression and the magnitude of their ambitions, which dwarf any other country we've seen over 120 years. I'm convinced they seek complete global domination and the eradication of democracy. And the evidence is clear as to how they treat their own population, how they've treated the Hong Kong citizens, the eradication of individuality, the concentration camps, and the genocide enacted on the Uyghurs. This is a society that would make the Nazis seem like they were playing at it. So we face a resolute, determined system that has been planning this for longer than we appreciate. And we are caught asleep at the moment with the enemy inside our walls.
And we seem to be going down two paths. We're competing, but we're not defending the way we should be. And do you have a prescription or a plan that can help America in that defense?
Well, I do. And this isn't unique, actually. Interestingly enough, if you look at the run up to 1914, and 1914 has the most similar parallels to this paradigm. And I say that because there's a 54-year commodity cycle I follow very closely. And every 54 years, at the peak of that commodity cycle, we go to war somewhere. We went to war in 1914. The next peak is 2025. So we've literally got months and years to act before we are swamped. This isn't the next decade. This is an imminent threat. And the problem that happened in Britain is there were pro-Germans in British society who basically were linked. There were cross-business linkages. Lloyd George, for example, the head of the opposition party, was incredibly pro-German. And only after the Agadir crisis in 1911 did he actually think that actually he may be wrong, but underneath it, he was still covertly supportive. And in the end, he made a statement which I would argue accelerated the onset of war. When, as everything heated up after the death of Archduke Ferdinand, he stated that Britain wouldn't support France if Germany invaded. And that wasn't the government's perspective, but it was the opposition's perspective. And of course, the Kaiser, in an opportunistic, aggressive mindset with his generals, took that as, well, they won't, but they made a fundamental error. They went through Belgium, and Belgium was a British protectorate because we created it post the Napoleonic Wars. And in that process, we were forced in. But you have to ask the question is if they'd gone directly through the Alsace-Lorraine territories, whether or not Britain would have stood aside as it had done in 1870. And therein is one of the challenges, is that when you're faced with an aggressor, if you provide an ambiguous terrain, as America is about the protection of Taiwan, the aggressor will always take I'm hearing that you're not going to intervene. And then if you do intervene, they're surprised as a conflict. So I think one of the key lessons is that alliance structures need to be rigid. If China invades Taiwan, America will go to war with all its might. There's no half measures. If you have half measures, they actually incite war, not the other way around. So that's been repeated at the moment. One of the interesting things is, and the royal family in the end had to change their name from a German name to Windsor because it was so embarrassing to be, German in Britain. And that's exactly what we've got to do first. We've got to remove Chinese influence from our Western institutions and society. We have got to stop our businessmen thinking that making money in China is okay to sell the future of their families and children in the process. And so we need a clear recognition by society that the Chinese are not someone that we're going to live with. They are implacably dedicated to our destruction, and that working with them in any shape or form takes place because they are gaining advantage and we are losing. So we have to shut the door. And that includes politicians, children, as the American president has right now. That includes every connection to China. Because one way or the other, this is going to happen. It either happens because the Chinese invade Taiwan and get away with it, and we shut the Iron Curtain at a time we don't choose, or we do it as part of a strategy, and we do it effectively before that moment. And I would advocate that's the only way to maximize a strategy against one of the most strategic nations the world's ever seen. They understand the art of war by Sun Tzu in an intrinsic way that the West have no idea about. They understand covert action and overt action. They understand the appreciation of intent and capability. They are the most formidable foe we've ever faced. And we need to wake up.
The question everybody wants to have answered is, what's the time frame on this Taiwan test? When would that be potentially happening?
Well, I think it's imminent. It's any time now. It was made more imminent by the irresponsible withdrawal driven singly by Biden from Afghanistan. Afghanistan wasn't just about a pilot war and $2.5 billion and 2,500 soldiers holding the line. It was a number of things. It was, one, an obligation to a nation and the allies that gave blood to maintain and see the process through to the end. The failure to do that shows a complete lack of intention. The same qualities that Kaiser thought he saw in the way that Britain conducted its Boer War 10 years before World War One. But Afghanistan comes at a time when it isn't just the single one in line. There have been failures in Iraq, failures in Libya, failures in Ukraine. Everywhere for 20 years, American foreign policy has failed. And that saps the intention to use military capability. And that's what a pilot war is. And so that signal is just loud and clear. And the fact Biden overrode everyone around him would make him my ideal opposition if I was Xi. I would want to take him to be my enemy. So that's the first thing. So what do the windows look like? Well, Red Lightning argues that we have moved through, in effect, the road to war. We've moved through it to the point where we are at the first stage of algorithmic expansion. So if you went and looked at, for example, Germany and Hitler didn't just try and eat Europe all at once. His strategy was first the Rhinelands. The Rhinelands meant that he could build a Siegfried line. The Siegfried line meant that essentially the French couldn't get to their allies, the Italians and the Czechoslovakians and the Poles. So the containment structure around Germany collapsed within months. Then the next he gobbled up the Sudetenlands, then Czechoslovakia. And then finally went for Poland, and then he went for France. So you can see the algorithm of expansion. The Chinese algorithm of expansion has been the first island chain, which has incredible similarities to the Siegfried line, because that defensive line means the Chinese control the South China Seas within it, and they also project power far enough outside to basically keep American carrier forces from helping their allies when they come to the aid of Taiwan or China or South Korea. So there is now a massive price. The US Navy has lost control of the region because of the evolution of an asymmetric weapon. And that weapon is essentially the Chinese very cleverly decided to use ballistic missiles, and they decided to put warheads on those missiles that could kill carriers. They started off with a DF-21. They went to a DF-26, which is an intermediate range. I've no doubt the DF-41, which is 15,000 kilometers, is going to have the same modifications. They've developed hypersonic glide weapons to put on them. And now, as we all know, they've got a hypersonic system which can navigate the world. In the analysis for Red Lightning, essentially what happens is they strike over 43 minutes and destroy every warship across the world's oceans using these systems that have been mass produced. And because we haven't developed a ballistic missile capability that can survive saturation on this level, we will lose all our warships. And there's only a recent piece about how they've created warships and destroyers in the desert so they can test fire these weapons with accuracy. I suspect we'll see a demonstration of capability such that the US Navy cannot help the Taiwanese, not without losing their carriers and their prestige, unless they concentrate, the number of defense destroyers and cruisers to numbers like 40 or 50 per carrier group, half the escort capability in a battle force, which just can't put to sea. So the Chinese, through the use of an asymmetric weapon, through mass production, have created an advantage where the reality is helping Taiwan could truly be just impossible. And the only way out of what I see is almost, we're in checkmate already, because once the Chinese take Taiwan, soon after the North Koreans will invade South Korea. There's a reason why the North Koreans have been there, why they test these weapons, is they're given them by the Chinese, because the Chinese have them singled out to take South Korea. And for the time, confusingly enough, it'll look as if it's a single act and it's separate from Beijing. It isn't. It's all one thing. And that means Japan is left alone, and it'll be very hard to defend Japan under those circumstances. So suddenly the Indo-Pacific is now Chinese. With over 65% of the world's manufacturing, they'll just consolidate and they can come for us whenever they want. We're in checkmate already.
We're in checkmate, but what can be done quickly?
The first thing is you've got to raise public awareness and you've got to raise the defenses. So you've got to get the Chinese outside the walls, and you need to get the guard mobilized. I need to give them all the weapons and money you can to enact it. So that means, more money aimed at critical defense tasks. The Navy needs more ships, and it needs greater building capability. All of these things require emergency war type programs rather than just peacetime programs. There is one area which I cannot account for, and that is America has a history of weapon development that is truly impressive. If you look at the B-2 or you look at the F-117, it appeared when no one even knew it existed. Now, within this balance of power, we know what the Chinese are doing. We don't know what America's developed in its skunk works or equivalent facilities. And if it has the ability to use lasers or weapon systems which can interdict these, that would be a balancing act. At the moment, though, we're not aware of them. And actually, a part of deterrence is when an enemy knows that there is a weapon system that can counter them. And this would be the time to reveal them before conflict breaks out. So I have to say, I'm slightly concerned that our box of tricks is actually empty. And I know that the US Navy has desperately been seeking lasers that can do the job. I think lasers on F 35Bs with their 25 megawatt lift fan provide some very interesting options for killing incoming missiles from above in blue sky without atmospheric aberration. So I think that's definitely one area that can even, and I talk about that in Red Lightning. I think more automation and greater ability to put, in effect, drone ships and submarines in the furthest reaches of peripheral defense. So instead of defending to 200 miles, your carrier force defends to 800 miles using drones and outer rings of defense. There are lots of ideas in Red Lightning, because in Red Lightning, I talk about two carrier groups. One is it's based on British warships, but it's the same parallel, really. The one is that essentially a carrier force of comparable capability to those deployed now is overwhelmed. And there is another carrier force, which is the product of experimental evolutional weapon systems, which are all available to us, could all be accelerated, and they are able to cope with this saturation process. So I do see this is not insurmountable. We just, first of all, have to wake up to the threat. We have to mobilize ourselves, and we have to treat this as if we're at war, because we are. And one of the things that fascinates me is in my book, Breaking the Code of History, which came out in 2009, that was really written back in 2004, where these ideas were formulated. In the section under disease, I talked about my prediction that the next global pandemic would come from China, from a Chinese weapons laboratory that was a product of an arms race in biological weapons to seek asymmetric advantage. And I think the evidence is absolutely irrefutable that this pathogen came from a Chinese laboratory. There is evidence that the PLN was working on, by their own publication in 2015, they were working on weaponizing bat viruses into aerosols for asymmetric economic advantage. And it seems a rather coincidence that, something they said they did happened in the world from a Chinese laboratory. And in a study on my website, I talk about the probability of this being an intentional assault. And I think we should be treating it with the greatest of caution and assume until proven otherwise, that's exactly what happened. Why we haven't done that is quite fascinating. I suspect it's a combination because our Western leaders don't want to confront the reality that we are back exactly where our ancestors were in the run up to 1939 and the run up to 1914. I think we're taught that somehow we learned our lesson and it would never happen again, but it is. And I think the other part of it is that essentially our leaders are strategically they're not educated. There was a time when, both in America and Britain, for example, that you would find politicians with military experience that had a very firm grasp of strategy. I'm afraid our politicians do not have a firm grasp of strategy. In Britain, it's absent. In America, actually, it's more prevalent. America has one advantage. You have some incredible institutions in your military. Your senior admirals and your senior Marines are extremely well educated. So you do have a bastion to call on and to mobilize, but you just have to mobilize yourself politically. And I don't understand why a president wouldn't understand this, because one of the qualities of decline, which America is suffering from, is fracture. So the polarization between your political parties is not unique to America. Sadly, it's a function of decline with less to go around, adaptation thinking you each know the way forwards, and you fight each other, which makes you more vulnerable. But there is a tremendous political advantage to basically combine those elements and face off against China, because it's well known that you can bond internal groups of people that have different opinions if there is a greater threat. And never has America faced a greater threat than this. So I think there's a political opportunity to bond America to common cause. But what you need is a great leader. And Biden is the very opposite. And I suspect his vice president is equally the same. So there is a problem that in the years running up to 2025, the next up until 2024 are occupied by someone who's unable to do this. So what does that look like? Well, I'm not going to talk about the civil dynamics of change, but I will give you an example that works within the construct of governance. And that is Britain. And after 1936, when the Germans marched into the Ruhr, the British public knew exactly what that meant. That meant Germany was rearming. And if they were rearming, they were coming for us. And at the time, there was a prevalent concept that the bomber would always get through. It was created by the RAF at its origins, who didn't want to be a tactical air force, didn't want to be subsumed back into the army, which is something that America went through too, and wanted to define strategic bombing as a unique capability and domain of the third armed force. And during the 30s, this concept built up that the bomber would always get through, as in it was no use defending against it because it was always going to happen. And your only defense was deterrence by having an equal force that was going to get through too. It was an early version of mutually assured destruction for nuclear weapons. But the British public did something rather unique. They demanded some measure of protection against these bombers. And the Air Ministry, that was rather stodgy and steeped in the bomber always gets through mindset, essentially acquiesced, and Fighter Command was born. They gave it to a man called Dowding, and Dowding was extremely technically competent because he'd headed the RAF Research Division and had headed the studies on radar. And he implemented a system which was the first, multi-dimensional air defense system the world's ever seen. And because of that, we survived the Battle of Britain. And the reason why I think that's interesting, he wasn't rewarded, by the way, he was fired just afterwards, and so was Park, his number two, because the Air Ministry never forgave him for going against them. They could never put that above the fact he'd saved the country. A reason why I mention it is that public demand can have a huge effect. And right now, the American public should be clamoring for protection against what is growing in the South China Sea.
Author of Red Lightning, David Murrin. Thank you, David.
It's my pleasure, Paul. Thank you for the privilege to speak to your listeners.
Thank you, David. Red Lightning is available at Amazon and his website, davidmurrin.co.uk.